Today we're going to talk about a thing called a paradigm shift, which is a complete change in science. Every few hundred years you get a revolution in what we're thinking. And here we've decided that there are possibly two types of disease. The ones that can be described in terms of changes to the physical molecular structure of the body, and another type of disease which is purely energetic. That is a disease that relates to an error in the body field. And this, of course, has been the cause of a lot of head scratching for 20 years. It didn't just happen. I have spent dozens of hours wondering about what happened in my clinic when I was working in Merimbula in New South Wales. I've sent dozens of people from my clinic to the doctors for pathology tests for hepatitis A, B and C. I think, well, it's a notifiable disease. You have to make sure it's not being spread. Not one of the people that I imagined had hepatitis A, B or C ever came back with a positive answer from the pathology people. This is after many, many years of doing this, and I began to think there was something wrong. And then something even more devastating happened to me. Somebody came to me with leukemia. I did a test matching with ampules of real microorganisms, and of course I went through them all, and I got roundworms. Now here is a beautiful error. This is why we don't like to say we're doing diagnosis, because the body field comes up with nonsensical things that we don't understand. I mean, leukemia and roundworms, nobody in the world can say that they're related in any way. This led me to wonder about how we could be so wrong using a standard method of matching. And this is the story of this lecture about how we began to revolutionize our ideas about what is happening. We decided that we were thinking wrongly. Since the 19th century, we have got a great deal of research on the microbiological world, and yet natural therapists have always had misgivings and said, no, we feel there's something more, there's something different, it's not quite right. Well, of course, microbiology, as far as it goes, is fine, no argument at all. But there's something that you should remember, and that is that the huge discoveries related to genetics apply to all living things. People think we're doing the genome of man, which is true, but the actual genetic material of life on Earth is the same, whether it's a protozoan, a politician, or another type of mammal. That means that when we say we've got the interest in genetic codes, it's not just about us, it's about us and other things. In other words, it's how we relate to microbiology and its world. There are only 23 main categories. On this slide you can see some different categories of bacteria. They're just some subdivisions. But if you look at the subdivisions as a whole, there aren't really very many. There are 23 main families of viruses, plus other families of bacteria, amoeba, and so on. Inside of these categories, there are literally hundreds of strains which are recognized by one or other of the 5 immune systems in the body. So if we're looking for energetic terrains, what are we looking for? Well, if we're going to find them, we're going to find them in these 23 or so main families of microorganisms. The physical pathology we're now going to talk about, this is the one we're most familiar with, and on this slide we can see a slide which is about real viruses. The physical pathology is like this. Microorganisms reproduce inside the body. To do so, they use a genetic mechanism that involves the breaking of hydrogen bonds in the crossbars of the RNA double helix. These hydrogen bonds appear to link directly to body field structures. So I'm saying here that we've got the real bug, and there's a possibility that there's a picture of a bug in space that is less than real, and in fact it's just an energetic structure in space. Microorganisms can upset the body field to the point that we feel ill. This is because bacteria create toxins, but viruses don't. What viruses do is they get right inside the nucleus of the cell and begin slightly to change what is happening in the genetic material of the host, which can be us. So that's a little bit sinister. Here we've got a slide called HCON. These are names of the major elements that we use in the body in biological transformation. Hydrogen is possibly the most important one because it's a bond that will make and break quite easily. And we're saying this is the place, the hydrogen, the oxygen, nitrogen or carbon, this is the kind of place where we're going to get bonds breaking in the molecular activity of biology. And when this happens, we've got a link to a body field. I'm saying this is the area we're looking at. Here we have an introductory slide about what is an ET. Energetic terrains occur in the body, which are energetic disturbances rather than physical ones. And we're getting what we call a distortion of the human body field function. That's one thing. That's the energetic component. But we've got a physical component as well, because the human body field can also be distorted by the presence of amoeba, molds, yeasts, bacteria, viruses, and so on. So we're going to be becoming more interested in this lecture about the energetic errors that can occur due to the field that is generated when energy fields pass through the DNA structure. It's a very tiny structure, so we're talking about mini fields. They're very, very tiny fields. In the course of my discoveries in the 90s, I was trying to find all possible meridians from the Chinese system because, frankly, that's all we had. I thought these might be structures that were important. And then we found that there were 12 only of the 92 or so Chinese meridians that would match with DNA and RNA. 12 out of the 92. This was most interesting because when I began to combine them, 1 and 2 and 1 and 4, and it turned out that they naturally wanted to be in sets of 4. And then I get sets of 4, 8, 12, 16, so on. This was all very interesting because when you get this matching wanting to belong in a group of 4, it means there's a structure there that you're finding out about. So it then began to appear as if the body could arrange its own field naturally as a protective mechanism against microorganisms. This isn't the immune system where we've got cells in the blood eating things up or forming antibodies. This is an energetic immune system, and this is truly a revolutionary concept. It looked as if there was an energetic distortion in the human body field matrix, and we began to call this a terrain that could host information and could be the cause of a disease. Now here we've got to look at a bit of history. For years in the 19th century there raged an argument over whether or not we should be treating the bacteria's terrain or whether we should target the bacteria. As you know, as it happened, we got antibiotics which target the bacteria. And to this day, allopathic medicine leaves the terrain almost alone, ignore it. But as it appears, this whole historical argument, which raged at the time of Pasteur and later, it was all about nothing, as arguments frequently are. It turned out that what they were perceiving was that there was a real organism and there was a possibility of a disturbance to the body field that was purely energetic. And this was probably what the argument was about. The terrain, which is the place where the microorganism thrives, is of course found in the mucous membranes of the chest, throat, intestines, bladder, and in cavities with poor blood supply. This is the idea of modern microbiology about this is why we get bugs in those places. But we can go a little bit further and say, how is it that the influenza bug likes to go to the ear, nose and throat, but it doesn't go to the big toe? Why has it got one place that it will thrive in and another not? The modern microbiology doesn't have a very clear answer to this one. Perhaps there is a need to look at it further, and we can supplement microbiology with some energetic ideas. I don't believe they're in conflict. The ET pharmaceuticals facilitate or repair the ET distortion in the human body field. Great, we're doing an energetic correction for an energetic disease. So the ET pharmaceuticals can possibly treat or correct the errors remaining in the human body field after the physical disease has gone. So it's a possibility we could use ET, energetic terrain correctors, for treating after a person has had a flu. That is an idea. Because some people, the flu lags on for months, even years after it's supposed to have gone. So we would expect that a large number of ETs have at some stage in recent medical history have been suspected as having links with cancer. Now, I didn't know that my list of ETs were on the cancer list until somebody handed me a great big textbook from an American university saying just that. If we view cancer as a massive distortion of the human body field, it's only natural that little bits and pieces of organisms, microorganisms, in particular certain families of viruses, will have a contributory role. I'm not saying cause, I'm saying a role. The body appears to have its own brand of its own field correctors. And I believe that I've found out what some of them are and put them together in a certain order, rather like the genetic code, so that it can correct the body field to get rid of energetic terrains. The funny thing is that these only work when they're assembled in the right order. And I spent some considerable time, if not years, finding out what that correct order was. In this, it does resemble genetics, but I don't think it is. It's as if we have to present pictures to the body in the correct order before it actually knows what to do. Now, here's a real slide. Yeah, this is where I spend my holidays, and you can see the deck chair just in the background there. This is to show, different pictures have different emotional effects. Can we see the next emotional effect? Thank you. Well, we get a different feeling when we see that. The body's just like that. When all our terrains are in good order, when the body field's in good order, we feel good. This is leading you to a very, very interesting idea, is that we get from energetic fields in the body, we actually get as if the field goes through the DNA spiral or RNA and projects a picture. And that picture becomes part of our hologram, a part of our picture of who we are. Here's another picture showing the energy source, which could be distorted electromagnetic waves, it could be gravity, all sorts of things can come there. The projection goes through the DNA, and then there's something that seems to focus the energy. We think it may be the centriole. Of course, there are two centrioles. The screen is in space, but it could be projected onto a tissue. For example, it could be projected onto the tissue where the disease, the physical disease, actually appears. On this slide, we can see that ETs are parts of the body's energy field that are able to match to entire families of parasites, bacteria and viruses, etc. And experimentally, the components for the ET correctors or the ET infoceuticals came from components that all go into compartment 10. That's of some interest. So really, our infoceuticals for ETs are just pictures of what the normal body should look like. I don't want you to think that there's some kind of thing that's going to cause conflict or difficulty in the body. They're not like nosodes, which is a picture of a bug. We're not putting a picture of a bug into your body when we're using energetic terrain correctors. We're putting in a picture of an energetic immune system, if you like. Now, if we're getting energetic terrains appearing on our screen in NES, that means there are a certain amount of bits of field damage in the micro. Remember, we're talking about the big body field aligner and the axes. That's about as big as the body field gets. Now I'm saying, we go to the opposite extreme. We go down to the submicroscopic body field, which is where it all happens. That's where the action actually is. Now, if you think about it, healing has to be possible. And there's a bit of difficulty with the present model of biology because it doesn't seem to acknowledge that healing is possible. We get all these amazing stories of a spontaneous remission, it's called. It means they heal themselves, but nobody knew how. Spontaneous remission is great. Why don't we learn how to do it? And I'm saying, well, part of the mechanism of spontaneous remission could be found here. The model you have been taught is that the pathogen invades and there is a battle between the antigens and the pathogen, the lymph cells and the pathogen, and the macrophages versus the invader. And these processes can actually be observed on microscopes, and you can see them in training movies. We don't have any problem with that at all. But there is another process of healing going on, which is an energetic process. It looks as if the body is able to assemble sets of 4 correctors to counteract long-term damage to the field caused by past and present diseases. Now, that's a pretty big statement, and I hope it's making you happy because it means that you can get better. There is a mechanism of the body that allows you to get better. As I've said, these ET correctors are in sets of 4, 8, 12, or even 16. In diseases, most of them target a particular organ, and cancers are the same. Nearly all cancers target a particular organ. Why is this? Why do they go for an organ? Looking at each of these components in turn, the ETs occur in specific tissues belonging to an organ. And here we've listed the organs, going from ET0 right up to ET15, which is fairly general. Though for ET15, we could indeed add that the kidney or the cell nucleus is affected. It was found experimentally over years of testing that the ET correctors made from the healthy body field pictures linked to the heart and to various organs and were able to match to many of the big families of viruses. That is a pretty important statement. ET correctors can therefore be legitimately used to correct the side effects of inoculation. They can't be used for inoculation instead of inoculation. I'm talking about, remember we said before that we may be able to treat the side effects of a long-term viral disease that didn't disappear. And that's why I'm saying, well, ETs can be used for when things go wrong with inoculation, and that's in particular ET0 is particularly for that, for young children who have exaggerated responses. And it's not very many, but they are there. Our research during 2005 indicated a possible mechanism for creating ETs even when there was no invasion of the microorganism at all. Now this is getting very interesting because we're getting phantom diseases that come from nowhere. And remember, historically, we had this big argument in biology about spontaneous generation of disease. Disease just comes from nowhere. Well, it doesn't. Everything, you know, it was eventually decided in the physical world, all bugs come from other bugs, to put it very succinctly. But now we've got the problem of rapid spread of disease and the failure, I think, my own view, of epidemiologists to explain how it was that HIV/AIDS occurred more or less at the same time all over the world, or it appeared to. Then there was a lot of genetic research tracing it back to a little village in Africa or something, which the Africans didn't actually appreciate very much. And gay airline pilots didn't really appreciate being told that they were the vectors for the disease, so it spread immediately all around the world. So this method of transmission of disease is always a bugbear in biology and microbiology. There is no really clear understanding of it. Of course there's droplet infection, of course people sneeze on you, of course there's blood transmission, fluid transmission, that's all fine. But what happens when we can't explain how a disease shifts rapidly around the world? Well, we have to come back and look at what families we've got, which are covered by the ETs. And here in the slide, we've got ET0 to ET15, going from measles, mumps, rubella, MMR, for ET0, going right up to more or less we don't know. Can I use those words, we don't know? Is that permitted? I think the first thing you have to learn to say in medicine is we don't know. But ET15 is for complex mixtures of ETs that we just simply can't describe. All of the others you see we've got associated with a particular viral family. And we've got a real interesting one there for ME. I'd like to talk about the ME one because I had it. You know, and you go to doctors and say, there's nothing wrong with you. They do blood tests. They can tell if you've got a viral infection by the way the blood looks. You have a full blood examination, you either got a virus or you haven't. And of course, when you've got chronic fatigue or ME, you traipse from doctor to doctor and everybody says there's nothing wrong with you. Meanwhile, you can't eat, you can't sleep, you can't work, you're losing your house, you know, the dog wants to leave home, etc., the car breaks down. It's fairly tragic when you can't cope, and it does affect your mental functioning to the point where I found it difficult to drive around without getting lost. That's fine, but this is in the place where I'd lived for 33 years in Melbourne. I was getting lost. So I didn't agree with the idea that there was nothing wrong with me, and the particular one we use for ME, which is ET7, is of particular interest to NES because both Harry and I had the same disease. And what sort of a disease was it? There was no treatment for it, except don't have too much coffee or something. I think I was told not to drink too much coffee. That was it. And it's a fairly tragic disease, like many of those that affect the nervous system. So we're saying, well, what on earth was it? It was a piece of field damage that in particular was going to affect the pituitary, the thyroid, the liver, and the pancreas. So it was, and the encephalon, part of the outside coating of the brain. So it had lots of terrains, but there appeared to be one common link between those terrains. ME is a very, very complex terrain. Now we look at a disease of degeneration of the nervous system, MS, that's a simple one because the terrain only affects the outside of the axon, the Schwann cells of the nervous system. Interesting. But the more complex they are, the harder they are to treat. There is coherent evidence from our matching techniques to support our view that it is possible that the two centrioles of the cell are somehow able to be part of the mechanism of the creation of an incorrect energetic terrain, and that the whole mechanism is driven by an outside energy. And here on the slide we've got geopathic stress, we've got solar flares, we've got Hartmann net and the Curry grid, which are just manifestations of geopathic stress. We can also add this to all sorts of things like e-smog, which happens in cities where you just get large amounts of electromagnetic radiation, all mixed up to make a sort of a smog. Here we see the centrosome, which is one of the organelles of the cell, and its links to the two centrioles. And it's because we've got microtubules, which, remember we said in one of the other lectures, was like a little tuning fork energetically. And I think we've got 9 little rows of tuning forks of 3, 9, 3, 27 little tubules. We've got 2 27s, 54 little tuning forks in the centrioles. We have some very, very interesting experimental data here about the energetic terrains, which was only done, I think, just near Christmas in 2005. We said, well, what kind of error is happening? Could it be just a degree? You know, if you're transmitting a picture and you transmit it at a different angle, you're going to cause a distortion of the picture, aren't you? So you've got an ET. So all we've got to prove that there's a distortion is show that there's a degree of error. So I decided one sunny day to say, well, what degree of error do we get with each of these energetic terrains? ET0 was 1 degree, ET1 2 degrees, 5 degrees, 12, 15, 22, 26, 32. In fact, as we went up the numbers, we increased the number of degrees of error. And by the time we got to ET14, it was 59 degrees of error. And at 15, we got to 60 degrees of error, which is substantial. Interestingly enough, when we combined ET1, 2 and 3, which we do clinically, that made a 45-degree error, which is huge. So that was derived from a set of matching experiments I did in December 2005. I think that might be some important information. On the slide you can see a picture of the DNA and how it reproduces itself by 2 processes called transcription and translation. This is how eventually we make new proteins for the body. They are assembled in a particular way due to the action of the genetic information on the ribosome. So from modern medical research, we do know that errors in genes can definitely be associated with syndromes and diseases. I don't think anyone's going to argue with that. But NES is suggesting that some things that look like genetic errors may not be. They may be incorrect translations or transcriptions of information that are caused by the presence of energetic fields. In the case of ionizing radiation, it's known that that causes a lot of genetic damage, which is already, there's a lot known about that. But I'm saying, can't we take that same process further and say, why don't we look at electric fields and gravitational fields? ET formation slide shows the energy source, which is distorted electromagnetic waves or gravity waves mixed with magnetic, projecting through the medium of the DNA, being processed in some way by the centriole and then projected onto the body field. So obviously the proposition may take 20 years of research to validate in any way. That is, the picture that you see in front of you is actual, it's a theory, it's an idea, But before you begin a research program, you've got to have an idea, where are we going? And this is a roadmap to tell us what sort of research should be done in the next 20 years. The idea is simple and fairly difficult to prove. What we've done with our matching experiments has simply excited us a little bit because we've now got an idea which could be pursued a lot further. An extraordinary thing happened in 2004, 2005. We discovered that the drivers would stop working when there was an ET causing a lot of trouble. And remember, the drivers are the source of our energy in the body. And remember, I also said in the first lecture that the symptom of all disease is loss of energy. Now, what if the ETs are able to stop the organ drivers from driving? That's why we get so tired when we get sick. It's beginning to form quite a nice, coherent, energetic picture of disease. This is a little bit about the protocol, stage 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, where we tell you when to introduce the treatments with the ET, which, as you can see, is on the third visit, from the third visit. How do you know when to use an ET? And I'm saying, well, we might need to use them for an extended period. When Harry and I were treated for ME, we were on these drops, the intraceutical drops, for 2 or 3 months, maybe more, maybe 4 months. And that's to stop it relapsing, otherwise it just goes backwards. Here's the information you need to know before you decide to go down the ET trail. The client has to have signs of geopathic stress, all right? And you will have learned how to do that in your course. And you have to ask, is the body mimicking another viral or bacterial disease that isn't actually apparent? That is, you need to know whether the disease is real in the real world or whether it's in our energetic world where different things happen. You need to observe and ask your client, does this condition relapse periodically? Remember, with ME or CFS, you think you're better, you have a whole lot of this and the latest miracle substance you eat. You get a little bit better and then you crash a few weeks later. So with ET pictures, we do get this constantly relapsing picture over a period of months. And you also have to ask yourself, is there any known cause of this disease? And I mean in the allopathic picture of disease, which is perfectly fine as far as it goes. All right, so if there's no known cause and it appears to be mimicking another disease, a real disease, and if there's geopathic stress and it relapses all the time, you've got a perfect picture for using an ET corrector. Now I'm going to give you a little bit of information about each of these ETs. ET0, this is for mental confusion, for poor learning processes, delayed development in children. Children who are strongly affected by childhood viruses. That is, you don't have to blame the doctor's inoculation for every childhood disease. The actual childhood diseases are bad enough when you get them. So that can cause exactly the same thing if you think about it logically. When you do this, you should expect some slow results with ETs. It might take 2 or 3 months, but you will see incremental changes which are for the better. Now I'd like to tell you a bit more about ET1, 2 and 3. ET1 for poor immunity, ET2 for poor immunity when there are heavy metals. ET3 is for poor immunity after a trauma, car accident, something like that, loss of a loved one. It is amazing how the loss of a loved one or a school examination or something can bring on a flu. That's, we're talking ET3 there. For all of these ETs 1, 2 and 3, it's mental fogginess, skin tags becoming inflamed, even chronic chest ailments. Now, if you've got ET1, 2 and 3 come up on your NES screen all at once, this is what I call emergency. And then you can use all 3 in one treatment session together. for as long as it takes, at least a couple of weeks. Now ET4, I'll tell you something more about that. This is for mental degenerative disease where there are suspected prions from a source in the food chain. You can expect some slow improvement, but you'll get at the same sort of mental fogginess here. ET5, broad spectrum virus, VSV, there are quite a large number of viral families here. But we have to look at papillomas and wart viruses in particular, herpes as well. Herpes are going to cause rashes in various parts of the body. Bear in mind there are 31 different types of herpes or something. It's not just one. So you have to know a little bit of microbiology. There's no excuse. You can go on Google and find out a little bit more about it. Any person with a history of malignancy in the breast, if this one comes up, it must be logically a candidate for consideration for treatment. Now ET6, this is for some varieties of influenza only. Remember, influenza and bronchitis, pneumonia, there are quite a large number of viral families and they're very specific. You as a therapist should know about them. It's also for some chronic chest ailments with no known cause. That is, you can't find any bug and you have a chest full of bugs, what are you going to do? Maybe there are no real bugs there at all. Now ET7 for CFS, I've already said a little bit about. This mimics encephalitis. And this one also links with other viral diseases. It mimics Epstein-Barr virus. It mimics papillomavirus, all sorts of things. Herpes virus. These will all show up in other people's testing as I think they're spurious responses. It shows that there's a lot of injury to the body field which is causing incorrect responses on your test. Now ET8, diseases related to slowness or degeneration of the nervous system. When there's a degenerative disease, it's very hard to reverse. I think everybody knows that. So you can't give too much false hope to your client, but you can say, well, with your permission, let us try and we'll have a go. ET9, chronic sensitivity of the digestive system. People who can't eat this, can't eat that, you get bad reactions to everything. Painful stomach with no known cause. That's because there are bugs or pictures that look like bugs upsetting the whole stomach and bowel, possibly even the throat. ET10, sore liver, cold or flu symptoms with no diagnosis, that is no medical diagnosis. ET11, general lethargy and poor appetite, exhaustion from no known cause. ET12, exhaustion and obviously issues with the liver. ET13, this is for the liver, the skin and the eyes. It's for all chronic and undiagnosable diseases of the large bowel. Well, that covers a very large area and it's actually quite common. People who believe they've got parasites should go to the doctor and have a stool test, and when they can't find any, if you like, you can go to another doctor and have another stool test. But I put it to you that this mimicking of parasites, of pictures of parasites which don't exist, is quite common. If this is the case, you can use ET13. All right, so I expect that one would be used rather a lot from my clinical experience when everybody thinks they've got parasites. ET14 for ear, nose and throat and chronic chest ailments. ET15 was when it was too hard, we haven't any idea. It's some type of bug we can't identify in any main category, but you want to do something. We think there is a link to the cell nucleus here. There is a typical example of how you might use the ET set in our NES protocol, so you can study that and work on it yourself. I don't have any comment on it because it's fairly mechanical. Masking. No, this isn't when you go to one of those parties and you've got to wear fancy dress. This is when you get a wrong answer or an answer that should be there that doesn't show up. This happens a lot in NES testing, it happens a lot in biological testing, and it's because if you're trying to read a map and you've got a wrinkle in the map, you can't see what's there, all right? And we could use, maybe one day we could use this technique for medical diagnosis. At the moment, we don't think it's quite possible. We're getting close. Masking effects. We ask you to treat with ET correctors in strict order, except in a really clear case of emergency. And that case of emergency, I've told you, is when ET 1, 2 and 3 come up all together on the same screen. Do not be alarmed if ETs vary from scan to scan. We would expect this to happen. All right, it's not going to be set in concrete. Every day, a different error is going to be more important to the body. Every minute, even. So don't worry if they vary a little bit. It just means that the body is creating pictures of disease and making itself sick. For the client, you should try to choose the ET that best matches the symptoms or organ pathology of that person. And just, if it doesn't show up one time, don't get too excited, it might show up on the next scan. They can come and go a little bit, particularly when you're treating them. Then there's this difficult case, which is quite common, which Harry and I have both had, I call it ET soup. It's when you've got 5 or even 6 ETs at once. What do you do? Here's the answer. If you've got ET soup, you have got quite severe geopathic stress. Has that occurred to you? And forget about treating the damage. Why not get to the cause? Go direct to the cause to try to stop the cause, and then see what you've got. And all of the infoceuticals listed on that screen are ones that will help to remove the source of geopathic stress. Of course, you can just take bottles of our medicine. There's another way, of course. You can move house, you can move your bed, you can move yourself, but because we have something that will treat it in a bottle, we suggest that that's what you go to first. And then if it's long-term and incurable, well, then you have to look at doing something a little bit more drastic. One thing I have to tell you about geopathic stress, if you've got this has happened to me, see, this is what I want to tell you. If you fly a lot, which I do, I fly all around the world giving talks and talking to people and giving presentations. If you've got a tendency towards geopathic stress damage, and if you've had ME, well, you do, each time you go on a plane, you've got to do a correction. So we're saying, look at it backwards and say, if you're trying to treat somebody with geopathic stress problems and ETs, can you persuade them to stop going on planes until we get them a little bit better? Because each time you go on a plane, you're going to cause massive damage to your body field. Naturally, this doesn't happen to everybody. I'm talking to people about people who have a tendency to react to changes in Earth's magnetism and so on. Not everybody, this doesn't apply to everybody. Finally, there's there's so many important points we're squeezing in. I have to tell you that the ET correctors, the ones in the bottle, the good guys are derived from the body's own mechanism for protecting its own field. That's what we think it is. And the interesting thing is that I haven't told you yet, is that all of them are linked to the heart. And so if you're going to be healed or have a healing crisis and get better, there's always that aspect, the emotional aspect. You have to have a change of heart. So you have to ask your client whether that is a possibility. Now I'm going to give you a quick summary of this whole lecture in 6 points. All right, here's our summary in a nutshell. First of all, Errors in human body field can slowly grow after 20 to 30 years of exposure to geopathic stress. You don't just suddenly get an ET. They're slow. Second point, the human body field can produce patterns that resemble energetically some parasites, some bacteria, and some viruses. Third point, the result is a disease that defies diagnosis by pathology tests, and we call it a bioenergetic disease state. This is where we're developing the medical paradigm to something else. The fourth point is that ET correctors used with geopathic stress correction can resolve some errors in some cases. It doesn't always work, but when it does, it's much appreciated. Results can take up to 3 months. Now, the fifth point, ET correctors are made from the body's own field correctors, and they're the bits of us that are self-protective. The sixth point is the sure way to know you need to do an ET correction is that an early test on the NES screen won't come right. And by an early test, I mean the BFA polarity or one of the drivers. If they won't come right, we have to look a little bit deeper and do an ET correction. Now, in conclusion, I have to say, I'm sorry, but that's the end of the ET lecture. And thank you for your attention. Going through a different paradigm, which is purely theoretical, is of course going to stretch your brain. And thank you for your attention. And all we can say is what they used to say in the Toyota ad years ago was, please consider. In other words, all of this is a possibility. So I hope that now you will understand when and how to prescribe ET correctors with great confidence. Thank you again.